This is the Terms of Reference Podcast, episode 163.
I thought I was coming in to brainstorm a little bit, talk them out of hiring me, maybe suggest some other people in the global development community they should consider. And through the course of my interviews, they said, no, we don't necessarily need somebody who already has an advocacy background. We don't necessarily need a global health R&D technical expert. What we need is a big picture thinker who can help to manage and design the strategy and take this coalition that's been around for 10 years and take it to a new level.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Today's conversation has two themes that I think are important for our listeners. On one level, you're going to hear about advocating on behalf of health sector innovators. But on another level, you're going to hear about what it takes to pivot a career and take on an entirely new role in a new sector after almost a decade of dedicated service in another. My guest for today's 163rd Terms of Reference podcast is Jamie Bay Nishi. For the past 9 years, Jamie was at DevEx, starting with member support and ending by leading the production of DevEx World. Only a few months ago, Jamie took over the leadership role at the Global Health Technologies Coalition, an advocacy organization in the health sector. This is a story of serendipity, but as with all stories of serendipity, it has its foundation in a great deal of hard work, experience, and personal investment. Today's conversation is about finding comfort with being vulnerable, how you can advocate in an environment that may not be receptive, how to absorb massive amounts of information quickly in order to communicate effectively with policymakers, and perhaps most importantly, what is possible for all of us in the social sector. I spoke with Jamie in Washington, D.C. But first, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Jamie. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Jamie, I know the answer to this question, obviously, but tell me where you're sitting today.
I think I'm sitting 3 blocks away from you in downtown Washington, D.C., just north of Chinatown and east of the convention center.
It's beautiful. This is what I love about technology. And, you asked me before the show, well, hey, why don't we do this in person? And just, that's just the way technology works. It's easier for us to get a good quality recording not being in the same place. How crazy is that?
There it is. I just said, we'll just have to grab a drink afterwards in person.
Done. You are the director of an organization called the Global Health Technologies Coalition. Before we get into some of the pieces that I want to talk about, because you and I actually have a little bit of a history we can talk about, why don't you tell us about that organization, what it does, and give us an introduction, and we'll sort of navigate from there.
Sure, absolutely. So the Global Health Technologies Coalition is a coalition that was started about 10 years ago. It consists of about 25 nonprofit organizations who are all working to advance global health research and development. So specifically, sometimes people think that means we're talking about mHealth or apps, but really what we're focused on is advancement of new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics that serve low and middle income populations in particular.
That was so succinct, I almost couldn't get my thing off mute of it. Fantastic. You have come to this role, and this is the interesting part, from an organization that probably everybody who's listening to this podcast has heard of, which is DevEx. Or, when we first talked, it was still called the Development Executive. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, not only to talk about GHTC, but also to talk about how one makes transitions in this sector that we're in. Because you moved from essentially a media company to now directing an advocacy organization. And that's an interesting move. Did you wake up one day and you're like, you know what, I've kind of, you've tied the bow, you've done what you can at DevEx, and you didn't see a path forward, or did this opportunity follow the sky and you're like, I have to do this is an opportunity? Or tell us that story.
Yeah, no, it was a combination of things. And, I've spent so many years talking about career trajectories for development professionals. And many people called me a lifer at DevEx because I'd been there for 9 years. The organization had been around for about 15.
Yeah, I mean, you were my first, you were
Yeah.
our first contact at DevEx. I feel like 9 or 10 years ago, you were our first contact for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. I was your membership coordinator for ISG. So, it was a great experience. I love DevEx. I still hang out with, we actually informally call ourselves, or I used to call myself a DevExer. Great organization. And I'm still really, really closely connected to the founders and to everyone working there. And it was an interesting ride across the 9 years. Why did I stay so long? It was never a dull moment going from a startup membership organization that turned into this larger media organization supporting the whole global development community. And it was really fun. I spent about 7.5 years there building up DevEx's membership division. And that's how I worked with you, Stephen, making sure that our members had access to all of the business intelligence and recruitment tools they needed to more effectively and efficiently do their jobs. And once I got pretty good at that and managing that piece of the business, I actually splintered off and helped to launch a new division of DevEx partnerships called DevEx Live, where we were designing in-person and online events to better connect DevEx's editorial coverage with the membership, with the rest of the global development community, and making sure we weren't just posting information on a website, but really able to engage two-way dialogue through those events. And I would say one of the capstone things I did at DevEx was produce DevEx World, which was a 700-person conference bringing together all sorts of stakeholders across global development, from nonprofit organizations to private industry to government, bilateral, multilateral, for a really dynamic day looking at the future of development. And I definitely would say that after 9 years and after accomplishing that, I don't think I'd run out of running room at DevEx, but I definitely started thinking, okay, that was huge. Where do I go from here?
So DevEx World, I mean, I think there's another one coming up here in a couple of months, or I can't remember.
Next year.
Okay, so it's next year. An event like that, as someone who organizes that, what is it that you expect to get out of an event like that? Is it the aha moment where there's a real breakthrough and you get commitments for something, like the Clinton Global Initiative used to do? Or is it a general sense of people, just sort of saying, yes, there's these new ideas out there? Is it the talks in the hallway where everybody can walk away and, just sort of have new ideas, new conversations? Or is it just sort of an energizing moment? Like, what was I want to put this together because?
Yeah, I think that there was a three-pronged approach for thinking about DevEx World. A lot of it was, how do we, without being brokers, how do we facilitate introductions so that new partnerships might organically form? So nothing as formal as asking for a Clinton Global Initiative type of commitment, but how could we bring this really eclectic group of stakeholders together? And DevEx had built up its footprint outside of the U.S. They are headquartered in Washington, and then had built up a presence and relationships in the West Coast with a lot of Silicon Valley leaders. And at DevEx, we started realizing that a lot of these different stakeholders aren't talking to each other. I sort of jokingly said there's an East-West divide. There's a lot of interest in supporting global development and eradicating poverty, eradicating disease, but how do we get all the right players in the room together and at the right level? It doesn't necessarily always need to be the top heads of government. How do we get that mid-level, the actual folks who have boots on the ground to be part of those conversations? And so that was a big part of it. I think also looking at the uncertainty of the future of global development back then, we were looking to really spark and energize the community and say, okay, we can put on an event that might feel like a Silicon Valley tech industry event, but for development. And how do we really get everyone excited to come and really celebrate the fact that they're part of this really cool and awesome industry?
Nice. And we've seen that in some of the interviews that we've had here on TOR, in the past, where we've been talking with people out in Silicon Valley, and there's clearly lots of energy out there, but how those connections are continuing to be made, that still seems to be a gray area. It's still a connection to be made.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So take us now to, you're at DevEx. Did this opportunity for GHTC fall out of the sky? Was it something that you actively pursued? I'm sure that you have a Rolodex to be envied from everyone, or envied by everyone. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so it sort of fell out of the sky, although it relates to what we were just talking about, which is DevEx World in an indirect way. A few months after DevEx World, last fall, I got approached by a recruiter at Path. And I should note that GHTC's secretariat is actually housed within Path, so the large international NGO that does a lot of global health innovation work. So a recruiter comes and talks to me and says, yeah, we have this position for this director job at GHTC, advocacy in global health R&D. And I took one look at the job description and said, well, that's interesting. Advocacy is a space I haven't worked in previously. But I also said, I'm not sure if I'm really qualified for this role. And I thought, but it can't ever hurt to, I would say this to anybody in global development. If you're approached about a job opportunity, it can never hurt to go in and have a conversation. And so I thought I was coming into Path to brainstorm a little bit, talk them out of hiring me, maybe suggest some other people in the global development community they should consider. And through the course of my interviews, they said, no, we don't necessarily need somebody who already has an advocacy background. We don't necessarily need a global health R&D technical expert. What we need is a big picture thinker who can help to manage and design the strategy and take this coalition that's been around for 10 years and take it to a new level. And then I thought, okay, this is a bit more interesting. And then my final round of interviews actually happened on election day. And then I thought, okay, I sort of thought the world was going in one direction, and then it turned out the U.S. was going in a different direction. And the VP of Policy and Advocacy at Path, Carolyn Reynolds, called me up a few days later and said, so what do you think? Do you want it? And I really had to chew on that for a few days. Did I really want to leave DevEx, this amazing organization doing incredible work that's grown so much that I'm so proud of? Did I want to switch gears and move into advocacy coming into this new administration? And I really did some soul searching on that one, but ultimately decided, yes, if someone's going to work in advocacy, the timing is now. That I felt like I probably could bring a lot to the table in terms of unique new skill sets for GHTC. And certainly there's a lot to be done in the advocacy space. The last thing I would just say about that quickly is that the DevEx World connection is it turns out I was referred for this position by somebody who I met at DevEx World. It does come back to the networking.
Yeah, and that's what we often find. The first series in terms of reference is all about, how do we develop these sustainable and satisfying careers, and networking is never, ever something that you can put, sort of half an effort into. What's the difference? So give us an example of, I guess, dive a little deeper into GHTC, not only about what you do, but how big is it? How many member organizations are there? What are the depth and breadth of your reach, and what kind of things that you look at when you're looking at new drugs and vaccines and these kinds of things?
Sure. Well, just to say, it's very, very different than my previous role. I spent 9 years building up my craft as a jack of all trades, supporting the broader global development community. And then overnight, I need to be this expert in global health R&D. So our ecosystem is pretty niche. I have 4 staff working with me, and we support 25 all nonprofit organizations, many of whom are product development partners trying to catalyze public and private sector investment to advance drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics. But we also work with academia and think tanks and some NGO implementers. So that's kind of the core community of who we're working with these days. A lot of our day-to-day substantive work is focused on U.S. advocacy. The vast majority is focused on U.S. advocacy and ensuring that the U.S. government continues to invest resources in advancing global health R&D. We also work a little bit in the multilateral space, so tracking what's going on at World Health Organization and with the UN system as we look at SDGs supporting health and an R&D target within that.
Clearly, all of the member organizations you're working on are advancing innovations in the health sector and drugs and vaccines and diagnostics. So that's one area to look at it. How is it that your role is aiming to communicate that differently? Or is there a different way to communicate it now? Or as you said, you're brought in to think of a big picture, different strategies about how to advance this. I mean, there's press conferences, there's congressional meetings, there's, the tried and true list of things that you could do. But are there different ways that you're approaching it so far?
I think I've tried to I've spent too much time with the human-centered design development professionals out there. I've come in and thought about what would I need or want to hear as a policymaker. And I think GHTC has built up a really solid track record over the last 10 years, a really good reputation on the Hill and with different policymakers. showcasing why global health R&D matters, often from a very sort of think tankish perspective. There's a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers on why, and I can share some of those with you if you're interested. I think from my perspective coming in, I wanted to bring a little bit of that DevEx media communications background that I built up over a few years and think about what is the higher level, the bigger picture story that we can be telling when we go to Congress about why R&D matters. We need to have a combination of kind of narrative project, what emotionally compels a policymaker to care about our issues, and combine that with some of the key statistics of why it should matter to them or their constituents. And so I think that's the new sort of spin, if you will, the new approach that I'm working on.
And are you actually, I don't want to say, writing bills and sort of putting those together, but are you helping with language? Do you walk things across the aisle to get signatures? Like, how involved are you? Or are you you're a voice that presents data? Or, how involved do you actually get in potentially crafting policy or regulation or legislation?
Yeah, I think that the vast majority of our time is spent focusing on big picture education, supporting the ecosystem broadly. But we do get called on by certain policymakers, certain congressmen or senators' offices to provide and suggest specific language when it comes to global health R&D. And we've done that several times. So I'm even looking this week. We've got some language that's been proposed with the National Defense Authorization Act. As we look at the Senate Foreign Relations Operations, some of the language that's coming through the Hill this week on global health R&D, a lot of that was actually penned by GHTC staff. And I'm very fortunate to have a U.S. advocacy officer who really knows her stuff, who's been leading that charge.
You're less than a year into this role. And
4 months.
You're less than 6 months into this role. And, coming from one type of organization to, as you said, sort of this bigger picture, jack of all trades, let's help everyone how to do better, to being laser focused on this one particular issue. Give me like the 2 or 3 most important stumbling blocks or biggest challenges that you've experienced so far that, maybe now even looking back 4 months in, you're like, oh, God, I wish I would have known that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely been a steep learning curve to really get caught up both on some of the technical aspects of the R&D work, as well as just getting a refresher on how the Hill works. I hadn't been on the Hill since, I think 2001 before I came back to this job, even for any meetings or anything. And so, just even remembering what happens during appropriation season, just sort of the processes has been quite a challenge. And I think that coming in as a director and being new without having all of that technical expertise is tricky. I've got a staff of really some tenured folks. They really know their stuff. They're very well entrenched and really steep in the issues. And I'm coming in thinking, wow, I don't know a lot of these things. So being okay with being vulnerable, I think, has been a challenge, and just making sure that I'm really leaning on my staff who are the true experts, whether it's U.S. advocacy policy, whether it's multilateral policy, whether it's some of the technical details about some of the products and vaccines and diagnostics that are being developed. I've really had to lean on them, but also making sure that I'm not a bandwidth constraint for them as I got up to speed. And I think that was a tricky thing to balance, especially the first couple of months where, for them, they were probably thinking, wow, who is this person from the outside who knows nothing about our world? Why is she here? So yeah, it's been an interesting adventure for sure.
Is there a moment that you can share with us that you're willing to share with us, I guess, of sort of falling on your face and having to, sort of either backtrack or just basically plod on and say, okay, I'll do it better next time?
There have probably been so many instances I'll have to think about. I think it's a lot of the small details that matter. So everything from thinking about, are we talking about the president's proposed FY18 budget compared to Congress's FY18 appropriations? Sometimes I've sort of muddled my words in there a few times and confused some of the staff saying, wait, what are you actually talking about? So I think that there have been a couple of cases like that where we've had to kind of come back and clarify and make sure that we're all on the same page. So it's a lot of small details, and I think that that's some of the challenges, just absorbing all of this information and making sure that we're really nailing all the correct points. And again, I think that that's huge kudos to my new team who have been really patient with me, where they've been having to kind of go back and check and make sure I've got the messaging right, making sure that we're saying exactly what we mean to say.
When you come to your website, the GHTC website, one of the big first words that you see on there is the word innovation. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you. But I also know that you're coming out with a report. I wanted to talk with that. How important is innovation as a buzzword for you and your members? And I guess I want to give you a lead into what this report is going to say, rather than the usual thing on innovation to sort of help others. But it's kind of an inward-looking report towards the United States, if I have it correct.
Yeah, absolutely. One of those interesting observations coming in from the outside is the use of the words innovation versus research and development. I've found that within the federal agencies and among the technical experts, they really talk about R&D. But when you're talking to policymakers, when you're talking to external stakeholders, private industry, Silicon Valley innovators, they really like the innovation word. So that's something that I've been really tracking. And even as we think about how do we present our work, it's proven to be an interesting discussion point and challenge.
Is there a real distinction that they make between? I mean, are there real hardcore definitions that they have?
I don't think that there is necessarily. I just think that there's a cultural usage difference between government sometimes and other stakeholders, which I find, again, takes me back to my time at DevEx, thinking about how do we bridge these gaps between private sector and some of the West Coast innovators and what's happening here in Washington. And I think that continues to be a struggle even as I look at my new, more niche world in the global health community. So the report is called Return on Innovation, and it's how U.S. government investments support global health R&D. And we're talking about how U.S. investments actually support U.S. jobs, U.S. economy, and U.S. global health security. So it might sound a little different than what you've heard about previously in the broader global development community. I think we've spent a lot of years talking about localization of aid. So it's interesting to be talking about this.
Yeah, so dive into the details a little bit. So what are some of the returns that you're talking about?
One key fact is that 89 cents of every government dollar invested in global health R&D stays within the United States, funding U.S. researchers and stimulating industry investment. GHTC did this report, did a similar study back in 2012, and the statistic back then was 63 cents of every dollar. So that's actually increasing in terms of support to the U.S. I think it's also worth mentioning the comparative. A lot of folks these days think that we've produced this report because of the new administration, and that's not the case. We've also seen, as we look at the trend line across the last decade or so, that overall U.S. government investment, if you exclude emergency funding for Ebola and Zika, overall U.S. investment in global health R&D has been on the decline, and that's in the previous administration as well as in the current administration. So that's something that we're really trying to highlight as we go to the Hill and we talk to policymakers that, hey, if you're looking at the U.S. right now, global health R&D spending isn't just going into a black hole overseas. It actually is supporting constituents in pretty much every state in the United States.
And how do you break through the noise? You're obviously going to face the same kind of issues that any advocate is going to face today. I mean, the fake news issues, the social media issues, etc. Is there a trick, or is there I didn't even use the word trick, but is there a process or a tool that you found where you can say, look, we have the truth, we have the data, and this is what you need to listen to?
Yeah. So I think that we have the credibility of the data that our research is based upon, which is we partnered with Policy Cures Research, and they produce annually something called the G-Finder report, which tracks global health R&D funding and investment across the world. And then we asked them specifically to help work with us to do a deeper dive on what's going on in the U.S. And beyond this report, one of the next steps we're going to take is breaking down the data further and trying to produce state-based fact sheets so we can look at economic impact, job impact, in some cases disease burden on a per state basis to really be able to go to a congressman or woman from North Carolina or Ohio or Texas and illustrate for them how this work supports and saves millions of lives overseas, but how it also supports their constituents directly. And I think that that's a message that, we've got this great data. And that's something that we're really fortunate a lot of other stakeholders within the global health or the global development community don't have. And I think that it will be taken pretty credibly because there's hard numbers backing this up. And some of those numbers originate within the U.S. government. So it's not like we've made them up from nowhere.
Is there a particular innovation or a drug or a vaccine or something that you can talk about from your coalition that's definitely benefited, a population in the U.S. or maybe a major population overseas, that it's something that's highlighted in this report as well? You say, hey, look, we're investing here. This is what's come out of it, and here's how it's had impact or effect?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I mean, we have so many members. It's probably not doing everyone justice to just mention one, but we only have so much time in the podcast. One interesting example I've been talking about a lot lately is Menafrivac. It's a low-cost meningitis vaccine, which has already prevented about 378,000 deaths and is on track to save $9 billion in treatment costs by 2020. So for meningitis,
crap.
That's pretty big deal.
That's amazing, yeah. That's global numbers? I assume that's not just U.S. numbers.
Correct, yes. Not that many people have meningitis in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. Where do you find that major customer base is for this vaccine? Or is it Africa? Is it?
Yeah, the report itself doesn't specify, breakdown in terms of regions, but it certainly includes Africa, Asia. I mean, it's pretty global where meningitis is. And the thing that's so great about Menafrivac is that it was able to be produced at a very, very low cost. So the accessibility, the access for that vaccine to reach a high population is feasible. In many cases for meningitis, the costs were so high it was prohibitive for low and middle income countries.
It's just exciting when you're able to see that one thing, one innovation such as that, $9 billion in savings. Does communicating it that way, again, I'm trying to get back to this sort of what's effective with policymakers, because it's great to be able to say, look, we just saved you $9 billion, but then they're like, well, we never spent that, so it's not a reality to us. Do you feel like that does that make sense, or and that's really effective, or is there another way that you have to communicate it?
I think that does make sense, but I would say another way that we've been communicating some of this information that I think has resonated on the Hill is showcasing how U.S. government investment is catalytic to private sector investment. You have a lot of policymakers who are saying, why are we throwing money into global health R&D? Why should we just continue to be one of the lead funders in this space? Why can't others step up to the plate? Or why can't private sector take this on? And the reality is that private industry, when you're looking at some of these neglected tropical disease products, there's just not the financial incentive for them, right, to spend that much money for something that is not going to be marketed at a very high cost. But what we have presented on the Hill that I think is resonating quite a lot is just the return on investment from U.S. government. So, for example, just to throw another stat at you, for every dollar the NIH spends on basic research, it generates an additional $8.38 of industry investment. So again, this is on basic research. So, by the end of 2023, we're looking at U.S. government's 2015 investment in global health basic research alone, spurring nearly $4 billion in additional industry activity. And I think that idea that U.S. government isn't the end-all, be-all, but that it's the catalyst to help encourage other stakeholders, whether it's private industry, other governments, other foundations, to be able to actually help advance this research is quite strong.
How much time do you spend talking to those other industry, private companies, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, you've got your coalition of nonprofit organizations, which, they're private businesses. Okay, but that's my nit to pick. But are you going out there and are you talking to Pfizer? Are you talking to, the big pharmas, and you talking to whomever else might be contributing the other $7 that you generate from one NIH dollar?
Yeah, absolutely. So while they're not currently part of our coalition membership, we are very engaged in understanding the perspective of private industry. For example, at this Return on Innovation event launch we're hosting later this week, we've asked for Johnson & Johnson to come in, and they're going to talk about just this. They're going to talk about how they're working with the Department of Defense to advance some reproductive health products. And that seems like an interesting, reproductive health, DOD, and Johnson & Johnson. Put that together.
I was just going to say, you're blowing me. That just blows my mind right there. I don't even know why they're coming together, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, so that's the type of examples that we're trying to engage with private sector. We're asking them, I've often said rather than me telling that story, we're trying to bring their voice into a lot of the panels and the public events that we're hosting, so they can say it themselves. Why does this matter to them? And conversely, if U.S. government investments weren't there, would there be that type of incentive to do this research?
So You're 4 months in. This is, you've embarked on what is a new career, essentially. What do the next 2 or 3 years look like for you? As you said, you were brought in to be a big strategy thinker. You look at the bigger picture, find different ways to do things. Are there ways that you want to shake up the GHTC, or you think it's steady as she goes and more of the same, or what's it look like?
Yeah, I definitely want to shake things up a bit, but I also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So GHTC, again, it's had a really great success many great successes in the last 10 years. And I want to make sure we're building on that and not diminishing anything that has predated my arrival at the coalition. But I definitely think that there's a lot of organizations out there beyond the 25 we work with today who care about global health R&D. And I think that if you think about technologies, even if we're not getting fully into mHealth yet, thinking about biofood fortification, vector control, pesticides, there's a whole additional range of technologies that we could be working with and supporting more in our advocacy. And I'm glad you mentioned private industry. I think that they also have to have a voice at this table. So trying to figure out strategic ways that we can engage private industry, academia, other governments, other advocacy groups, other stakeholders to come together. So a big part of my goal is to grow the coalition, just like I spent years growing DevEx's membership.
Do you think that it would fundamentally change the flavor or the impact or legitimacy, the credibility of GHTC if you had a Johnson & Johnson sign on or Pfizer or something like that? You'd go from 25, 27 nonprofits to, for-profit organizations, and who knows, there's umpteen other, device providers device manufacturers, et cetera. The medical technology field is quite vast. Would that start to change the flavor? Is that something you'd have to manage, or I'm just going to leave the question there?
Yeah, I think we just need to be really careful about how we grow and how we think about engaging these other stakeholders. So I think one of the concerns is if you start to bring large multinational corporations into the membership or into the mix, does that mean they become the elephant in the room and that some of the messages or the interests of the NGO community are not heard as much? And so we're really trying to think about, maybe it's not a one-size-fits-all type of membership. Maybe there's different tiers. My sense is that private industry may not want to be as vocal on some of the advocacy issues that we take point on when we go to the Hill or when we go into the multilateral space. But I think they want a seat at the table for some of the discussions, and I think they would benefit from some of the intelligence we provide and some of the tracking of what's going on in the Hill from a global health R&D perspective. So, I think we need to walk before we run. I think we need to bring private industry to the table and engage them in dialogue and have them get to know our coalition and sort of feel that out a little bit, and then figure out what is the most strategic way that private industry, private sector should engage. Is it the current membership structure? Is it another way? Is it at partners level? And that's something I'm trying to work on and sort of envision and think through right now.
I've made the assumption here, but I should ask the question, is it only member contributions that keep you funded, or do you also have grants and other contracts that you do, or?
Great question. So the vast majority of our funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then the remainder comes from the membership.
Talk to me about some of the more tangible outcomes maybe you've had in the last 4 months. I know that you said you were kind of going through appropriation season. When we were talking before the show, you mentioned that you may have had some influence on how some of the next budget is going to be happening in the United States. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I think that some of our more recent wins, just because all the U.S. budget stuff is literally happening this week, maybe to take a step back on the multilateral side, we've had some exciting things happen. Most recently, last week, when the G20 met in Hamburg, we've been working for months to ensure that global health R&D innovation remains a priority for G20 countries, especially as we look at pandemic preparedness and the increase of antimicrobial resistance. And so we actually were able to get some language directly included in the G20 communique focused on global health R&D. At the World Health Organization meeting, World Health Assembly back in, was it April or May? The months are all running together. It's been pretty intense. But we worked with different advocacy partners, with different stakeholders to ensure that There's a essential diagnostics list. Right now, there's an essential medicines list out there that makes it easier for countries to fast track and review and adopt particular medicines for different disease areas. We wanted to make sure there was a parallel list in existence for essential diagnostics tests. And that's something that's just been approved this summer, that the process for that will be stood up. And by early next year, the World Health Organization should be reviewing new diagnostic.
One of the questions I ask on the podcast is, how do you see the work that you're doing become a standard basically move from innovation to standard operation? But you just told us, right? I mean, is that a typical path for the type of policy advocacy that you put out there, where if you're successful, it gets written into, this is how we do things, either by WHO or someone else?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. So for us, it's not just getting the win on paper, then it's also following up and figuring out how, what is the next step? So what is the committee that selects the diagnostics? If they're starting with 3 disease areas, how do they then expand that over the years to come to 10 areas? We know they're not going to be able to do that day one, but how do we stay engaged throughout the process to make sure that the actual innovations or the efficiency gains or the support structures that are needed are actually there to support the ecosystem. And the same is true on the U.S. front. So looking at what's going on within Congress and within U.S. politics right now, President Trump proposed in his original FY18 budget proposal, a 23% cut to parts of NIH, a 25% cut to USAID and State Department global health programs, with zeroing out of HIV/AIDS account, and a 49% cut to global health security, 20% cut to CDC. So those were pretty scary numbers. And fortunately, a lot of members of Congress said this isn't just dead on arrival, this is going straight to the trash. But, what we have been doing ever since those numbers came out is going to the Hill, having a lot of meetings with congressmen and senators' offices from both sides of the aisle, talking about how, what is the impact? These things can't happen. And fortunately, as we look at the House this week, and again, who knows what will happen by the time this podcast is published, there's a lot of moving pieces right now, but we're actually looking at NIH receiving $1.1 billion above FY17 spending, including protection of the Fogarty International Center, which has been something a lot of folks have been worried about getting eliminated. We're looking at sustained fundings for CDC Global Health. We're looking at maintaining PEPFAR money to support that HIV work. But, so there's some silver linings there potentially on the House side, but we're still looking at additional cuts to USAID, additional cuts within certain parts of CDC that touch on emerging infectious diseases and a lot of the global health security issues we're worried about. So, it's just a constant effort every step of the way to make sure that not only is the language in there supporting, that the funding is there, and then in the cases where there are global health R&D components within programs, that the funding is actually getting to where it's supposed to be, so that work is actually getting done.
So, Jamie, the last 2 questions I have for you are 2 that I ask everyone here on the Terms of Reference podcast. And the first one is, who do you pay attention to in order to now stay up on this new job? I mean, you're 4 months into it. And so have they now given you sort of a list of, here's the magazines, the Twitter feeds, and the blogs that you have to read every day? Or is this sort of figured out as you go? Who do you pay attention to?
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate to get the list of here's the places to look. I think it's been an interesting combination of who are some of the thought leaders in the global health space. So, I'm tracking really closely what's going on, for example, at the Kaiser Family Foundation. They produce really great reports and really great aggregation of information of what's happening in our industry. I'm also really trying to keep a pulse of what's going on the Hill. So reading The Hill or reading Politico, reading a lot of the Congress-oriented media publications has been pretty important. And then I'm looking at outside of government and outside of Washington, who are some of the big innovators out there? So, of course, we're tracking what's going on with the Gates Foundation, but we're also really interested in emerging philanthropists like Priscilla Chan Zuckerberg. We know that they're starting off focusing mostly domestically on education, but she's a medical doctor, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them branch out into health or global health R&D in the future. So we're looking at some of the newer players coming to the scene as well.
The last question I have for you is that you have a unique position, having been with DevEx for 9 years, and now you've embarked on this new adventure for yourself. But is there a particular innovation outside of GHTC that you're particularly excited about? It could be any shiny new object or process or technology or just a thought or a conversation that you're having that you'd love to get a shout out to that you don't think is getting the attention it needs yet?
I don't know if it's a particular innovation, but an area where continual innovation is needed that I'm thinking about a lot these days is antimicrobial resistance. When you look at what's happening in Russia right now with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and you look at just this huge new area where traditional drugs are no longer effective, I see this huge gap and this huge opportunity for innovation looking at antimicrobial resistance. So it's not an innovation per se, but if there was a focus area, that's definitely something I'm looking at and thinking about quite a lot.
Jamie, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I wish you all the luck in your new role.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hey guys, if you like what you're hearing and you find value in conversations like these with Jamie, can you take a moment and give us a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to be listening to right now? If you really like this episode, share it with a friend on Facebook or on Twitter. And of course, you can always ask us a question at the post on aidburner.com. Thanks.